My name's James and I paint minis. This is Spoon37 Minis.
So, in Further Wash and Dry Brushing Part 1, I showed you how to use wash and dry brushing on various parts, including the base and the spikes and things like that. In this video, we're going to continue by dry brushing the tentacles and the flesh. So we're going to start off with these magenta tentacles, so to make them appear vaguely as they did for the official photos where they fade from a magenta into a flesh colour. We're going to do that fairly literally by taking the base colour, Screamer Pink here, and mixing it with the flesh colour, Bugman's Glow. As ever in my videos, when I mix a colour, I do try to show you. I don't take it as read that you know all about paint mixing. So here we are using our cocktail stick method. This saves us using lots and lots of brushes to do this, by the way, because you don't really want to use the same brush to keep dipping into both pots because you contaminate both pots. So I've got roughly equal amounts, 4 spots of each on the palette, and then I'm going to use a third cocktail stick, which already has a lot of paint stuck to it, although don't worry, the paint's dry, to mix it all together. Now, partway through mixing this together, I'm looking at it and thinking this looks far too close to the original base colour, the Screamer Pink. So, after a bit, I decided to get more Bugman's Glow and add that to the mix. Now, as you can see, it's not a lot extra that I add, but those couple of extra spots do actually move it closer towards the colour that I want, which is sort of halfway between the two colours in the pots. Obviously the magenta seems to be the stronger of the two colours, so I need to use slightly more of the weaker colour, Bugman's Glow. Now I'm using the Citadel starter brush because some of the areas I'm going to be dry brushing are quite small, and as ever we get some on the brush and then wipe it off on the tissue so that most of it is gone, and then as we brush it over these tentacles, brushing away from the armour, you'll find it starts to pick up some of the raised edges, some of the details. Obviously all of the recesses I'm trying to leave dark so that the magenta colour is pretty much the darkest colour on them. One other thing to point out, you'll see that I keep going back to the palette simply because this brush doesn't actually hold very much paint, so I do have to keep loading it up and wiping it on the tissue. That's perfectly normal when you're using a fairly small brush for dry brushing, whereas you notice in the first part of this video, I actually used a larger brush for example for the base or the spikes, and that held a lot more paint so I could keep going for a lot longer without returning to the palette. I have to confess, trying to dry brush this loincloth was difficult. Not to go over the armour, I found going sort of lengthways was the best approach, but it didn't catch all of the edges I wanted to, so later I did have to correct this a little bit with a different method, but I'll do a video on what that method is a bit later on. The reason I keep dry brushing near the feet is because of that tentacle sticking out at the back of the ankle, which obviously you need to make sure is just as highlighted as all the rest, otherwise it'll look slightly out of place. And as you see, doing these ones on the back, partly doing raised edges, but mainly aiming to get the tips of the tentacles looking lighter than the bit that's actually poking out of the armor. That way you get a little bit of a graduation, and this will be further reinforced by doing the same with pure Bugman's Glow later on. I'm hoping you can start to see by this point that this actually is not only increasing the contrast on these parts, but also picking out some of the details that weren't really visible with just the base colour. Some of the ridges and lumps and bumps on these tentacles are now suddenly visible where they weren't before. Moving on to the next Plague Marine. This one's a little bit weirder because it's kind of got tentacles and a claw on one side and then none on the other, so most of this is concentrated around this right arm, but there's a few little tentacles coming out of the back behind where the backpack attaches. Again, trying to focus on the tips of the tentacles, although this claw in the official photos was kind of reverse highlighted, so it was actually flesh coloured towards the wrist and then got darker towards the tips, so kind of trying to dry brush in that way, so it might look a bit weird what I'm doing, but that's the idea, just trying to think of where it needs to be lighter and where it needs to be darker as I'm doing this. Now again, you might wonder why I'm bothering so much with these ones that may be covered by the backpack. The fact is the backpack has so many sort of recesses to it. You will actually see these once the backpack is attached from certain angles, but they'll be very difficult to paint with the backpack in place, so doing it in sub-assemblies saves you a lot of bother. Now, as for the Plague Champion, I'm sorry it's a little bit out of focus right this second, I do figure that out in a moment. I'm not doing very much on this one because there are a few little tentacles around the sort of torso and feet, but the main thing he has in this colour is the mouth on the chest, and unfortunately if I dry brush that it will not only strike the teeth but it will also strike the armour as well. So I mean the teeth and gums had a lot of overspill from doing the armour in the first place, so I'm going to have to use a technique called layering on those, which I will show you in a subsequent video. Now I just got a bit of magenta paint on this power claw and using the age-old technique of rub it with my thumb and maybe it'll be okay. If you were wondering, no it wasn't okay, and yes I did have to paint over it later. Now again, be sure to catch these ones near the feet, which can be very easy to miss, and you can also accidentally cover them with base texture, which means you won't necessarily see them, but they are still there and they do still need painting, so be mindful of that when you're working on these models. Now, whilst it isn't a tentacle per se, this claw is going to be attached to that tentacle I already did on the first Plague Marine that I showed you, and so the colours really need to match up. It needs to be highlighted in the same way with the same colours, otherwise it's going to look very strange when it's a completely different colour to the rest. So, although I am mainly trying to highlight the tips here, so it looks like a dark magenta claw with almost flesh coloured tips, I also need to highlight it a bit near the wrist so it matches up with the tentacle from before. Moving on to one of the showiest parts with these tentacles is the backpack holding on to the plasma gun, which is for the Plague Champion, of course. And this one has a lot of textures and it's really worth using dry brushing for this technique. Even if you weren't planning to dry brush later on, it picks out all of the ridges that are in these tentacles, particularly on this side, where you'll see it's pretty much plain right now, but as soon as you start dry brushing along the length, it suddenly shows a load of ridges that you couldn't see before. So it's a very good technique for picking those out. Now, having done all of those bits with the two colours mixed together, we're now going to use exactly the same brush and the same parts, but we're just going to use Bugman's Glow instead of Bugman's Glow mixed with Screamer Pink. So obviously this time I'm not going to show you much on the palette because it can just be assumed that it is the neat colour which I've put on the palette, got onto the brush and then wiped off on the tissue. Other than the change of colour, the technique is exactly the same. I'm focusing on the tips, obviously more towards the tips and less on the rest of the tentacles, because obviously this is a further highlight, not trying to obliterate the one that went before. But otherwise, I think you can already see the tentacle now has more of a graduated effect on it, and each of the tentacles will get lighter towards their respective tips. Just as with the previous video and the previous steps on these, the real trick is just to avoid getting any overlap or overspill onto the armor or any other details that you don't want to be this color. Obviously anything that sweeps completely away from the miniature is a good idea, and anything that sweeps generally along the length of each tentacle seems to work fairly well. As long as you focus mainly on the tips at this point, it should have the desired effect. Hoping you see already that's made quite a difference, and all of these are now much lighter at the tip but just as dark in the recesses. Moving on to the next Plague Marine, same technique again, just remember that the claw is kind of reverse highlighted, so the top of it is the flesh colour but the tips of the claws are dark. Although at first it doesn't look like terribly much, it does gradually build up into quite the highlight. Also hoping that you can see with these small tentacles on the back, it doesn't actually take very much, but a few brush strokes and the tips of them do look lighter and it makes a much better, more graduated effect than we had before. I'm going over the claw several times to lighten it, but I actually think I might need to come back in and use a slightly different technique on it just to get the bit by the wrist where it's difficult to get in with dry brushing because of course it's actually a recess. So we'll have to come back and tweak that, but you get the idea for now. Now working on the Plague Champion. As before, we're not going to do the chest area because that needs a different technique, but this big tentacle on the side and the small tentacles on the back will all need the same treatment as the other two have had by dry brushing with Bugman's Glow. With some of these shorter tentacles, we're really focusing on just the tip rather than the whole tentacle, just to ensure that the end of it is flesh coloured, whereas the middle of it was the colour we did before. And so you should get a slight graduation as you go from the base of the tentacle to its tip. Just a small amount of dry brushing on this claw, again mainly just to make sure that the tips are getting to more of a flesh colour, and then obviously a little bit around the wrist where it meets with the other tentacles, simply so it blends together. Nothing too crazy though. Moving on to the champion's backpack, you remember these rather more voluminous tentacles, they're actually really long on this one, so there's a lot more to do. But again, you're focusing more towards the tip, and because there's a lot of texture, I'll flip it round and do a bit towards the base as well, just because the tentacle is so thick it would naturally have a peak. You may not see too much once the model's assembled, but I still think it's a step worth doing because there's a lot of extra detail to show if you do this. So you see with just a few brush strokes you get more detail and more highlighting, and so I think it is worth doing this. Now, I might seem to have skipped an introduction, but I'm actually continuing with the same Bugman's Glow and the same brush. The only difference is instead of doing the tentacles, I'm doing these fleshy tubes. Now what this does is it re-establishes the base colour in the centre. So although what I used before wasn't strictly a wash on these, it was more of a custom glaze, this actually re-establishes the middle. So now it's only the recesses that are that sort of magenta purplish type colour that we mixed before, and that means that going forward if I do any further highlighting on this, it will be highlighting a flesh colour rather than highlighting that sort of pinky purpley colour. Same again, but on these two little tubes here. It doesn't take long because there's not much to do, and then we move on to the champion, who of course we have a whole face to do. So this will be a little bit more involved because obviously we'll want to get the face highlighted, but we don't want to get any of this paint on the tongue, the pipe to the side, the spikes, or the armour nearby, so we've got to be careful. I do go a bit back and forth here. It's mainly to ensure that it's balanced front to back, so that I, Haven't got, say, the back of the head super highlighted and then the front of the face not so much, and then in the middle it looks strange. So I do go back and forth and just check it from all angles just to make sure it's fairly even. Right, so that's about as far as we can go on these Plague Marines details with just wash and dry brushing. So I'm going to show you what they look like in a still picture. Here you can see the metallics are shaded, the spikes have been shaded and highlighted, the tentacles have been highlighted. It's all looking a lot more detailed than it was. Same again for this one.
Right, if you've watched this far, firstly thank you for watching. If you did like it, please hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell-shaped icon so that you know when the next video will be coming out. I'm hoping to keep a release schedule of about 2 videos a month.